The Peloponnese is a peninsula in the far southern tip of mainland Greece. The region played an indispensable role in the development of ancient Greek civilization through the political influence of major city-states such as Sparta, Corinth, and Argos, and through the religious influence of the ancient Olympic Games. And so in this video, let us explore the Peloponnese during the time of the ancient Greeks, its human geography, and the major political events that took place there. The earliest continuously inhabited settlement in the Peloponnese, and one of the oldest in all of Europe, is Argos, first inhabited around 7,000 years ago. Argos is situated in the center of a small fertile plain, one of the few good agricultural regions in an otherwise mountainous peninsula. This region around Argos, known as Argolis, makes up one of the 7 traditional regions of the Peloponnese, which had been in place from the time of the ancient Greeks to the present day. From approximately 1750 BC to 1050 BC, the Peloponnese, along with neighboring regions of Greece, was dominated by the Mycenaean civilization, which likely consisted of semi-independent cities in loose confederation with one another, each ruled by a local king. 2 major Mycenaean cities were Mycenae and Tyrants, both located near Argos. Mycenae was situated on an especially prominent hill overlooking the Argive plain, and its ruins, with giant boulders making up its walls, remain one of the most significant archaeological sites in Greece. The early histories of societies around the world are told in mythologies, and ancient Greece was no different. In Greek mythology, which was supposed to have taken place during the Mycenaean period, the king of Argos heard a prophecy that he will one day be killed by his grandson, and to prevent this from happening locked up his daughter in a bronze chamber where she subsequently had a baby with Zeus, the king of the gods. The baby, Perseus, was exiled from Argos with his mother. Perseus grew up to become a great hero by killing the monster Medusa and later rescuing the princess Andromeda. But after Perseus triumphantly returned home to Argos, he accidentally killed his grandfather in an athletic competition, fulfilling the prophecy. No longer able to stay in Argos, he became the king of Tyrants, and from there led a group of settlers to establish Mycenae on a nearby hilltop with the help of Cyclops, one-eyed giants who carried the boulders up the steep hills. Elsewhere in the Peloponnese, the king of Elis heard a similar prophecy that he would be killed by his future son-in-law. To prevent his daughter from marrying the would-be murderer, he challenged every one of her suitors to a chariot race, executing all of them after they had lost the race. Finally, a hero named Pelops came along, and Pelops bribed the king's charioteer to sabotage his chariot. During the subsequent race, the king was killed in a chariot crash, fulfilling the prophecy. Pelops married the princess and became the new king of Elis. He established funerary games to honor his deceased father-in-law, which became the ancient Olympic Games. The entire peninsula was named the Peloponnese in honor of Pelops. One of the descendants of Perseus was the hero Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, who was also fathered by Zeus. Heracles entered into the service of his cousin Eurystheus, the king of Mycenae, and was required to complete 12 labors, many of which took place around the Peloponnese, such as killing the lion at Nemea and the hydra at Lerna, as well as, rather embarrassing for a hero, cleaning out the stable of the king of Elis, which was covered in manure. Heracles and Eurystheus despised each other, and after the death of Heracles, his children were persecuted by Eurystheus and forced to escape the Peloponnese. Eurystheus was killed in battle pursuing the children of Heracles, and the vacant throne of Mycenae was taken over by the house of Pelops. This included Agamemnon, who led an alliance of Greeks on an expedition against the city of Troy to take back Helen of Troy. The story of the Trojan War was possibly based on true accounts of Mycenaean attacks against Troy, a city strategically located near the entrance to the resource-rich Black Sea region. Although the Mycenaeans prevailed, they were to soon meet their downfall, both in mythology and in real life. During the 1000s BC, the Mycenaean civilization suddenly collapsed, and cities such as Mycenae and Tyrants were sacked and mostly abandoned. We still do not know exactly what caused their demise. The next several centuries until around 800 BC are known as the Ancient Greek Dark Ages, during which literacy was lost, and most Greeks lived in isolated village settlements with little trade between them. In Greek mythology, 80 years after the Trojan War, the Peloponnese was invaded by a people from northern Greece known as the Dorians, who were led by descendants of Heracles returning to reclaim their ancestral lands. The Dorians split up the wealthiest parts of the Peloponnese among themselves, while the indigenous populations, often referred to as the Achaeans in ancient Greece, held out in more remote parts of the peninsula. There is no way to know nowadays to what extent the myth of Heracles' descendants were based on actual migrations and invasions that led to the fall of Mycenae, but what we do know is that by the time literacy returned to the Peloponnese in the 700s BC, much of the peninsula was settled by Greeks who spoke a shared Doric dialect and held shared Dorian customs, distinguishing them from Greeks living elsewhere. During this time, the village settlements of the Greek Dark Ages coalesced into the first city-states, or polis in Greek, which usually consisted of a town with dependent surrounding areas, built around a citadel called an acropolis where temples were located, and where the local inhabitants could escape to for safety when needed. As these city-states expanded, they inevitably began fighting with one another. Warfare developed to involve heavy infantry organizing a close formation called the phalanx. The soldiers in the phalanx were called hoplites, named after the large round shields they carried. This was the primary mode of Greek warfare during the Greek Archaic period, from 800 to 480 BC, and the ensuing Classical period, which lasted until 323 BC. One prominent city-state to emerge in the Peloponnese during this period was Sparta, which started out as 4 neighboring Dorian villages in the fertile valley of the Eurotas River in the far southern Peloponnese, between the Parnon and Taygetus mountains, and from there they conquered the other local peoples in the region. The political entity that they created was technically not Sparta, but rather Lacedaemon, and Sparta was just the capital of Lacedaemon, although the names Sparta and Lacedaemon were often used interchangeably, and for the sake of simplicity I will just refer to all of this as Sparta. The core territory of Sparta around the Eurotas Valley was named Laconia, which constitutes another one of the 7 traditional regions of the Peloponnese. Laconia is strongly associated with Spartan culture, and the word laconic eventually entered the English language to mean a person or writing style that is very few in words, as talking excessively was heavily frowned upon in Spartan culture. Sparta was ruled by 2 kings from 2 different hereditary families, both of which claimed descent from Heracles, and they shared power with various councils and assemblies of Spartan citizens. Spartan society was highly stratified. Only the men from Sparta itself could be citizens of Sparta and serve in the Spartan army, and there were strict property requirements for maintaining Spartan citizenship. The free inhabitants of the other areas that Sparta had conquered were known as the Periokoi, who, unlike Spartan citizens, were allowed to handle money and engage in trade. On the lowest tier of Spartan society were the Helots, with slave-like status. After controlling Laconia, the Spartans expanded westward across the Taygetus mountains into Messenia, the southwestern region of the Peloponnese, also settled by fellow Dorians. Messenia was conquered after a series of long, brutal wars, followed by rebellions, lasting multiple generations. Large numbers of Messenians and their descendants became Helots, who farmed the land and provided Sparta with the economic base needed to sustain its war machine. In turn, much of Sparta's military resources were devoted to keeping the Helots in check. To the north of Laconia and Messenia was the mountainous, sparsely populated region of Arcadia. It was associated with Pan, the Greek god of the wilderness, forests, pastures, and pastoral music, and as such has long been romanticized as an idyllic sanctuary undisturbed by the dins of civilization. One motif from art history, for example, is the Latin phrase, adding Arcadia ego, even in Arcadia I exist, referring to death itself. But ancient Arcadia was anything but idyllic. It was a harsh, remote area far from the sea with almost no arable land, and its economy was centered around raising sheep. Its mountain peaks are covered with snow in the winter, and lions and wolves attack the shepherds eking out a living in the valleys below. The ancient Arcadians spoke a dialect likely directly descended from those spoken by the Mycenaeans. The 2 main Arcadian city-states during the Archaic period were Tegea and Mantinea, on opposite ends of the main valley in Arcadia. Although they had a rivalry with one another, they were also located at the crossroads of the Peloponnese, and had to frequently look over their shoulders at stronger neighbors, such as Sparta. To the west of Arcadia was the region of Elis, centered around the valleys of the Peneus and Alpheus rivers. Elis, with its fairly large and fertile plains, was one of the few regions in ancient Greece capable of supporting the raising of horses and cattle. This was perhaps why so many mythologies that took place in Elis, such as Pelops' race or Heracles cleaning out the stable, involved large farm animals. Indeed, Heracles was able to clean out the stable in one day by simply diverting the waters of the Peneus and Alpheus rivers, flushing the manure out. The Eleans, like the Spartans and Messenians, also spoke Doric Greek. During the Dark Ages and early Archaic period, the Alpheus Valley was a major trade route connecting Elis to the rest of the Peloponnese. In the summertime, as local herders moved their flocks from one pasture to another, they gathered at an open site near a major ford of the Alpheus River to renew their friendships with one another. And over time, a local cult dedicated to Zeus developed there. Athletic competitions were held in honor of Zeus, which eventually took place in the summer every 4 years as the ancient Olympic Games, traditionally dated to have started in 776 BC. At first, only the local Peloponnesians participated, but as the prestige of these games grew, they expanded to include Greeks from around the Greek-speaking world. Elis, the primary city-state in this region, managed the Olympic Games, and as such enjoyed a great deal of prestige. Elis was ideally located to host an event that brought all the Greeks together. On land, Olympia was located near the intersection of roads in the Peloponnese. By sea, Elis had excellent harbors, allowing Greeks from around the Mediterranean, especially those from the Greek colonies of Sicily and southern Italy, to reach it easily. By the 400s BC, the Achaeans were so wealthy that they were able to build at Olympia a new temple of Zeus, and inside the temple they commissioned a giant statue of Zeus seated on his throne. The statue was supposed to have been over 12 meters tall, covered with gold and ivory plates, and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Northeast of Elis, on the southern shores of the Gulf of Corinth, is the mountainous region of Achaea. According to Greek mythology, the Achaeans originally lived in the Argos, but were displaced by the Dorians and forced to migrate into the mountains of the northern Peloponnese. Compared to the rest of the Peloponnese, Achaea was fairly slow to develop into city-states, and very little is known about its history during the Archaic and Classical periods. One of the most significant city-states in Achaea was Patras, which is now the largest city in the Peloponnese. To the east of Arcadia, where we started our survey of the Peloponnese, is Argos. By the beginning of the Archaic period, Argos, now under Dorian rule, was again the main city in the area, easily dominating Mycenae and Tyrants nearby. Argos also frequently dominated the nearby town of Nemea, where Heracles killed the Nemean lion. Nemea was the site of a prestigious athletic competition known as the Nemean Games, which took place in the spring every 2 years before the Olympic Games and another game, the Pythian Games, held in Delphi in central Greece, serving as preparation for these 2 more prestigious games. In eastern Argos were 3 more small city-states. The first was Epidaurus, which contained a sanctuary dedicated to Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, and sick people from around Greece visited the healing temple at the sanctuary. The sanctuary contained a theater, one of the best preserved ancient Greek theaters and still in use for performances today. The second city was Hermione, located on the south coast of Argos and supposedly established by descendants of indigenous Peloponnesian tribes rather than the Dorians. The last was Treason, on the far eastern tip of Argos. Epidaurus, Hermione, and Treason were protected by mountains from Argive influence and were usually independent of Argos, and sometimes not even included as part of the Argos by ancient geographers. Instead, their coastal location meant that they had frequent interactions with other city-states around the Saronic Gulf, which obviously included Athens, but also the city-states of Aegina, founded by settlers from Epidaurus and located on an island with the same name, Megara, located on the Isthmus of Corinth, and the city of Corinth itself. Corinth, then and now, is the most important city in the region of Corinthia. Ancient Corinth had 2 harbors, an eastern harbor in the Saronic Gulf facing the Aegean Sea, and a western harbor in the Gulf of Corinth facing the Ionian and Adriatic Seas. The Acropolis of Corinth, the Acrocorinth, was especially formidable, with its own water supplies to withstand a long siege. A garrison at the Acrocorinth could easily cut off the land route in and out of the Peloponnese through the Isthmus of Corinth. Corinth also organized the Isthmian Games, which, like the nearby Nemean Games, were held in the spring every 2 years before the Olympic and Pythian Games. These were the 4 main games in the Greek religious games calendar. These unique geographical and religious advantages easily made Corinth one of the most prominent Greek city-states. And finally, on the border between Corinth and Achaea was Sicyon, a small Dorian city that was usually subordinate to one of the major Peloponnesian city-states of Corinth, Argos, or Sparta, but would still one day have its brief moment to shine. Between around 750 and 550 BC, the Greeks left their homelands in large numbers to establish colonies around the Mediterranean, motivated by both population pressure and trade. Many colonies, in turn, established sub-colonies. Altogether, the mother city, or metropolis in Greek, the colonies, and the sub-colonies often formed networks of closely aligned cities. Corinth was one of the most active of the Greek colonizers. To the east, it founded the city of Potidaia, a major port city in the North Aegean. Most Corinthian colonial interests, though, were towards the west, where the two most significant Corinthian colonies were located. The first was Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, which strategically dominated traffic in and out of the Adriatic. The second was Syracuse in Sicily, which would become one of the greatest of all the ancient Greek city-states. The Corinthians, along with the Corsarians and Syracusans, established more colonies and sub-colonies along the Ionian and Adriatic seas in what is now Albania and northwestern Greece that serve as trading posts with the interior, giving Corinth huge commercial interest in the region. Outside of Corinth, the Achaeans took the short sea voyage westward to establish multiple colonies in southern Italy, including the influential city-states of Sybaris and Croton. The Eleans took the short sea voyage northward to the mountainous region of Epirus and established a handful of colonies there. Sparta was known to have only established one colony, albeit one with a unique origin story. Since only Spartan citizens could serve in the military, it faced serious manpower shortages during the brutal wars against Messenia, and in desperation, allowed unmarried Spartan women to hook up with periokoi men. But after the conquest of Messenia, the Spartans retroactively declared all the men born from these relationships to be illegitimate and stripped them of their Spartan citizenships. They were kicked out of Sparta, after which they traveled to southern Italy and established Taurus, which became the modern-day major port city of Taranto. While colonization was ongoing, many Greek city-states also underwent major social changes. Most Greek city-states had previously been ruled by aristocratic oligarchies, but during this period, many of them were overthrown and replaced as tyrannies. The word tyrant had different meanings to the ancient Greeks than to us today, and simply referred to an upstart who seized power in his city without the legal or hereditary claims to power that the aristocrats had. One of the earliest known tyrants was Phidon of Argos in the mid-600s BC, under whom Argos dominated the Peloponnese. He brought much of the Argolis under his control and decisively defeated the Spartans in battle, giving Argos control of Kynuria, a remote, mountainous buffer zone between Argos and Sparta. He also intervened in Elis, at one point making himself the presiding officer of the Olympic Games, which was quite a power move given the significant role that religion played at the time. Argos likely remained a leading Peloponnesian power in the century after Phidon's death, although unfortunately we know next to nothing about this period of Argive history. Around the same time as Phidon, Corinth also came under the rule of tyrants. It had previously been ruled by an aristocratic oligarchy whose members claimed descent from Heracles. To maintain their rule, their members were only allowed to marry one another, but eventually the rest of the Corinthians rebelled, possibly because they were excluded from the wealth generated by colonization, and in 657 BC installed Cypselus as tyrant. Corinth prospered under Cypselus, who, rather uniquely for a tyrant, was largely able to maintain his power without resorting to force, and supposedly was able to walk around Corinth without bodyguards. He was succeeded by his son Periander, who ruled for over 40 years and brought Corinth to even greater heights. Periander ordered the construction of a paved trackway connecting the two Corinthian harbors with one another so that ships could be placed on wagons and pulled overland, sparing them from making the long journey through treacherous waters off the southern coast of the Peloponnese. This paved trackway no longer exists, although the modern Corinth Canal serves the same purpose. Periander sponsored the arts and built magnificent temples. One institution unique to Corinth was large-scale, government-sanctioned prostitution at the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. This gave Corinth a reputation for debauchery, and many other Greeks, especially the moralistic Athenians who wrote down much of what we now know about this period, were disgusted. Even if prostitution was common throughout ancient Greece, including in Athens, and if anything, the Corinthian temple sex workers had much better living standards than those almost anywhere else in the ancient world. But despite all of his achievements, Periander lacked the popularity of his father, and to maintain his power he ran a police state. According to one story told by the historian Herodotus, Periander sent a messenger to another tyrant, that of the city of Miletus in Asia Minor, asking for advice on how to govern. The tyrant of Miletus took the messenger to a wheat field, and without saying a word, began cutting off the highest ears of wheat one by one. When Periander heard the story, he understood what was meant. To maintain his power, he must preemptively kill or exile anyone who posed a threat to his rule. Periander was succeeded by his nephew, who was soon assassinated and replaced by an oligarchy. Many ancient Greek advances were attributed to the Corinthians. They built some of the first Greek temples with a classic design of a central building surrounded by side columns. And for these columns, instead of the austere Doric style popular in many parts of Greece, they introduced the ornate Corinthian style, emblematic of the city's wealth and vanity. They also built some of the first triremes, the standard worship for much of ancient Greece. The Corinthian helmet, with the signature nose guard, was also widely used throughout ancient Greece. Corinth had a major rivalry with the neighboring city-state of Megara, located midway along the Isthmus of Corinth. Megara, like Corinth, had a large network of colonies of its own, and so competed with Corinth on both land and sea. Corinth also had a commercial rivalry with Aegina, a major maritime power during the Archaic period. To counter both Megara and Aegina, Corinth very much applied the maxim, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," and so often collaborated with Athens. The two city-states enjoyed excellent relationships with one another during much of the Archaic period, with Corinth frequently supporting Athens through difficult times. Although this friendship could only survive if Athens did not grow powerful enough to challenge Corinthian interests. While Corinth was prospering, Sparta grew into the dominant power in the southern Peloponnese after it had fully absorbed Messenia. The Spartans launched many military expeditions into Arcadia, only to be met with stiff resistance from the Tegeae. After generations of fighting, the two sides came to an agreement. Tegea would keep its independence, but accept Spartan hegemony as an ally of Sparta. Sparta's northward expansion into Arcadia brought it increasingly into conflict with Argos, especially over Kynoria. The Spartans and Argives met in battle around 546 BC, and according to Herodotus, instead of sending their whole armies into battle, the Spartans and Argives agreed to each send 300 champions to fight one another to death, and the side with the last man remaining on the battlefield got to keep Kynoria. At the end of the battle, only 2 Argive and 1 Spartan soldiers were still alive, but the Spartan soldier was buried under so many bodies that the Argive soldiers thought they had killed all the Spartans, and so left the battlefield. When the Argives later found out that the Spartans had won on a technicality, they refused to accept the results and challenged the Spartans to another battle involving the whole armies, which the Spartans subsequently won, allowing them to occupy the region. The Argives were not content to lose Kynoria, and 50 years later, around 494 BC, they fought the Spartans again at the Battle of Scipia. The Argives were crushed, and lost so many men that they could not challenge Spartan hegemony for multiple generations. Sparta was now the dominant power in the Peloponnese. It had been signing individual treaties with different city-states in the peninsula, including Corinth, in which they accepted Spartan hegemony, often against their will. This network was referred to by ancient writers as the Spartans and their allies, although modern historians now call it the Peloponnesian League, for simplicity. The league was bound together by the treaties the individual city-states signed with Sparta, and their obligations were to Sparta, not to one another. For major decisions involving the whole league, a congress could take place, but only after the Spartans had first voted on the issues. Corinth was the second most powerful member of the Peloponnesian League and served as a counterweight to Sparta, sometimes even leading the smaller city-states to vote down Spartan proposals. Argos was the only major Peloponnesian city-state to remain independent of this league, and for the smaller city-states it provided an additional counterweight to Sparta. Although Sparta was now a superpower capable of intervening in distant affairs, it was still hesitant to do so, in part because it needed to keep its army close to home in case the Helots tried to rebel. And so, as much as we now like to romanticize the Spartans for their near-invincible army, it is important to remember that a major reason this army existed in the first place was to keep others down. The Spartan leadership sometimes debated among themselves if they should give the Helots more rights, perhaps even enlisting some of them into the Spartan army to relieve its frequent manpower shortages. But many Spartan elites also feared that if they were to give the Helots some rights, then very soon they would demand even more rights, and the traditional Spartan way of life, with all of its privileges, would be gone. Better to just keep the Helots enslaved. The Spartan oppression of the Helots also made many Greeks from other parts of Greece worry of getting too close to the Spartans, although they soon had no choice, because the Persians were threatening to invade. The king of Persia sent envoys to the Greek city-states asking for earth and water. Many Greek city-states acquiesced to these demands, but the Spartans threw the Persian envoy into a well, telling him he could have all the earth and water he wanted down there. In 480 BC, King Xerxes of Persia invaded at the head of a massive army, and the Spartans, against this existential threat, finally agreed to leave the safety of home and join the other Greeks outside of the Peloponnese. One of their kings, Leonidas, led a force of 300 Spartans to join the rest of the allied Greek army at the strategic mountain pass of Thermopylae in central Greece. The Greeks were betrayed at Thermopylae, Leonidas was surrounded and killed, Thebes, a rival of Athens, joined the Persians, and the Persians subsequently burned Athens to the ground. But as the Persians bore down on the Peloponnese, their navy was defeated at the Battle of Salamis by the combined Greek navy, made up of a large contingent of Athenian triremes, but also with significant contributions from Corinth, Megara, and Aegina. Without naval support, the Persians had no realistic chance of breaking through the Greek defenses on the Isthmus of Corinth, and so withdrew to wait out the winter in central Greece. The following year, in 479 BC, the final showdown between the Greeks and the Persians took place at the Battle of Plataea, with 100,000 Greeks under Spartan leadership made up mostly of Peloponnesians, including 5,000 Spartan hoplites, 5,000 Perioikoi hoplites, and 35,000 auxiliary Helot troops. The Argives, still resentful about their defeat to Sparta 15 years prior, were pro-Persian. They refused to join the Spartans and remain neutral. The Persians were again defeated and finally forced to withdraw from Greece. After the Persian Wars, Sparta was initially seen as the leader of the Greeks, but soon took a step back in international affairs to focus more on domestic issues. Meanwhile, Athens established its own alliance, the Delian League, consisting largely of Aegean islands and newly liberated Greek city-states in Asia Minor, as mutual defense against a potential Persian comeback. As Athens prospered, the Spartans became increasingly wary. In 462 BC, the Helots rebelled, and the Athenians sent an army to help suppress the rebellion. The Spartans, suspicious of Athenian intentions, told the Athenians to go home. This led to a surge in anti-Spartan sentiments in Athens, and the new Athenian leadership decided to preemptively strengthen the Athenian positions against Sparta. Athens allied with Argos, thus threatening the core Spartan territories. It also convinced Megara, which was again fighting a border war with Corinth, to leave the Peloponnesian League in favor of the Delian League, angering Corinth. A series of fighting known as the First Peloponnesian War erupted between Athens and Corinth, and soon grew to also involve Argos and Sparta. After a decade of on and off fighting that took place both inside and outside of the Peloponnese, the sides eventually signed truces with one another around 450 BC. Argos went back to being neutral, and Megara was sent back to the Peloponnesian League. Athens, though, now held on to Naupactus, a port controlling the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth, where Messenians expelled by Sparta after the recent rebellion had been settled. The Athenians became increasingly imperialistic over the next few decades, turning the Delian League more and more into its own overseas colonies and making multiple moves westward into regions where Corinth and Syracuse held strong interests. This involved forging an alliance with a region called Acarnania, threatening the Corinthian colonies in the area. It also involved establishing closer ties with Corcyra, which had a strong rivalry with Corinth despite being its daughter city. In 433 BC, an Athenian fleet intervened on the side of Corcyra in a naval dispute between Corcyra and Corinth, leading to a naval engagement between Athens and Corinth. Soon afterwards, Athens faced unrest in the Corinthian colony of Poteidaia, a member of the Delian League under Athenian control, but still with a magistrate appointed annually by Corinth. The Athenians sent troops to Poteidaia, the Corinthians also sent troops disguised as volunteers to support Poteidaia, and the two sides again exchanged blows. Finally, Athens placed a trade embargo on Megara. The Megarians grew desperate and appealed to Sparta for help. At the ensuing conference, the Corinthians pushed hard for war, and the Spartans finally agreed, starting the Peloponnesian War. The first stage of the war lasted 10 years from 431 to 421 BC. On land, the Spartans made frequent incursions into Athenian territory, and each time the Athenians retreated behind their city walls and avoided battle, since the Spartans, with a threat of Helot unrest at home, could only maintain these expeditions for short bursts of time. Instead, the Athenians used their overwhelming naval superiority to maintain the grain supply from the Black Sea region to Athens, while stamping out rebellions from Delian League members like Poteidaia. They also blockaded Corinth, especially from their naval base at Naupactus, devastating the Corinthian economy, and raided coastal areas of the Peloponnese such as Messenia, encouraging the Helots there to rebel. After 10 years of fighting, the Spartans and Athenians were both exhausted and concluded a peace settlement with one another. This unilateral move angered many Spartan allies, especially Corinth and Thebes, who felt that their interests had been overlooked. Argos, with Athenian backing, tried to take advantage of the surging anti-Spartan sentiment to start a new alliance in the Peloponnese, but only Elis and Mantinea joined. Sparta struck back hard to maintain its hegemony. The upstarts were routed at the ensuing Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC, the largest land battle of the Peloponnesian War. Elis and Mantinea were forced back into the Peloponnesian League, and Argos went back to being neutral. The Athenians reignited their war efforts in 415 BC, this time launching a massive, long-distance expedition against Syracuse. The Syracusans and Corinthians convinced the Spartans to again intervene against Athens, bringing the Peloponnesian League back into the war. the entire Athenian expeditionary force was destroyed in 413 BC in one of the greatest military disasters in history. Sparta was now determined to take down what was left of the Athenian Empire. It renewed the land invasions into Athenian territory and even accepted Persian money to build a fleet. The inexperienced Spartans were initially no match for the Athenian navy and suffered defeat after defeat. But finally, under their general Lysander, annihilated the Athenian fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC. Without a fleet to protect its grain supply, the Athenians gave up and surrendered, ending the Peloponnesian War. The war left Sparta as the sole hegemon of Greece. Not only was Athens subjugated, but even Corinth, which had pushed so hard for the war, was economically devastated by the Athenian naval blockades and lost much of its commercial influence. The Corinthians wanted Athens destroyed, but the Spartans vetoed the idea, since a weakened Athens could still provide a counterweight to Corinthian revival. The Spartans were even more oppressive than the Athenians, and to be fair, it's hard to expect people already famous for their mistreatment of the Helots to behave otherwise. In 395 BC, the old rivals Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, and the Persians got together to form an alliance to take down Sparta. Politics really do make the strangest bedfellows. In the ensuing Corinthian War, the near-invincible Spartan army again won in the field, but could not dislodge the allies from the Acro-Corinth. The war only ended when the Persians switched sides in favor of Sparta and forced the belligerents to make peace. But in return for maintaining its hegemony in Greece, the Spartans gave away to the Persians the interests of the Greek city-states in Asia Minor, reversing almost 100 years of their independence that those like Leonidas had died to help achieve. Continued Spartan bullying around Greece angered the Thebans so much that they again went to war with Sparta. The decisive engagement came in 371 BC at the Battle of Leuctra, where an inferior Theban army upset the Spartans, killing one of the Spartan kings in the process. Afterwards, the Theban army marched into the Peloponnese and freed both Messenia and Arcadia from Spartan rule. In Messenia, the freed Helots established the city of Messene to safeguard their newly won independence. In Arcadia, the city of Megalopolis was founded to defend against further Spartan encroachment into the area. Megalopolis would develop into the primary city of ancient Arcadia. Sparta tried to make one more comeback against Thebes at the Second Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, but Thebes again won. In the generations after the Second Battle of Mantinea, Sparta went into a slow, terminal decline. Not only did Sparta lose the economic resources of Messenia, but it was also running out of soldiers, since joining the Spartan army required Spartan citizenship, which had strict wealth requirements. As wealth accumulated at the top of Spartan society, more and more Spartan men simply no longer met the criteria for Spartan citizenship, and were barred from serving in the Spartan army. In the 340s BC, the Kingdom of Macedonia rose in the far north, and King Philip II of Macedon, after subjugating multiple Greek city-states, sent the Spartans a threatening message. "Should I come as friend or foe?" To which the Spartans replied with one word: neither. Aggravated, Philip wrote back, "If I invade Laconia, you will be destroyed." And the Spartans again replied with one word: if. Things did not go so well for the Spartans this time. Philip invaded Laconia and devastated much of the land, although did not occupy Sparta itself. And afterwards, Sparta kept its independence and did not have to join the Greek alliance under Philip's control. But after Philip died in 336 BC and his son Alexander the Great took power, Sparta started trouble by leading an alliance of mercenaries and neighboring states against one of Alexander's generals, but was crushed in battle, and subsequently forced to join an alliance against its will. Alexander the Great went on to conquer the Persian Empire in the 320s BC, and after his premature death in 323 BC, Greek civilization spread around the eastern Mediterranean in the form of successor kingdoms such as Macedonia and Egypt. Greece itself, including the Peloponnese, became increasingly peripheral in this new Greek international order. In the chaotic decades after the death of Alexander, the Greek city-states launched many rebellions against the Macedonians, but mostly failed. The Macedonians continued to maintain strong garrisons in Greece, including at the Acro-Corinth. The Achaeans in the mountains of the northern Peloponnese now came to the forefront of Peloponnesian politics. They had previously established a local alliance in the 400s BC known as the Achaean League, and around 280 BC the league was re-established by 4 city-states in western Achaea, including Patras. Within a few decades, the Achaean League expanded to include almost all of Achaea, and reached a major milestone in 251 BC when the Dorian city of Sicyon joined. Under the leadership of Aratus of Sicyon, the Achaean League kicked the Macedonians out of Corinth in 243 BC. With the land route between Macedonia and the Peloponnese now shut off, a number of previously pro-Macedonian cities such as Argos and Megalopolis gradually came under Achaean League control. Meanwhile, the Spartans continued to intervene in Peloponnesian affairs, even though their influence was declining. By the 240s BC, only about 700 Spartans still met the citizenship requirements, and land ownership was concentrated in only 100 families. To revitalize Sparta, 2 generations of Spartan kings, Agis IV and Cleomenes III, introduced reforms such as debt cancellation and the distribution of land to periokoi and non-citizens. Agis was arrested and executed by rival Spartan elites for his actions, but Cleomenes ultimately succeeded in seizing power from the councils and passing the reforms, and from there led a resurgent Sparta against the Achaean League. Success did not last long. The Achaean League under Aratus allied with its longtime rival Macedonia to keep the Spartans down. In 222 BC, Cleomenes was deposed, Sparta was occupied by an invading army for the first time in its history, and the old Spartan hierarchy was restored. Sparta managed to maintain its independence for a few more decades until 192 BC, when it was finally forced to join the Achaean League. The Achaean League now ruled all of the Peloponnese along with some neighboring regions such as Western Crete. It was organized as an alliance of independent states, each with its own government, but also sharing mutual responsibilities such as defense. Its government structure later influenced James Madison in the 1700s as he worked on drafting the Constitution of the United States. The Achaean League was closely allied with a much more powerful Roman Republic against their common enemy, Macedonia. Unfortunately, the Romans started to actively intervene in Achaean League affairs, especially on the side of Sparta when it repeatedly tried to break away from the Achaean League. When war again broke out between the Romans and the Macedonians, the Romans were so worried about the loyalty of the Achaean League that they demanded 1,000 hostages to be sent to Rome. Among the hostages was the son of a prominent politician from Megalopolis named Polybius, who went on to become one of the preeminent ancient Greco-Roman historians. Much of what we still know about ancient Greece and Rome of this period came from his writings. In 147 BC, popular sentiment in the Achaean League turned strongly against Rome because it was again siding with Sparta, and war finally broke out between the two sides. The Romans, under their consul Mummius, routed the Achaean League in battle and occupied Corinth in 146 BC. What happened next was brutal even by Roman standards. All Corinthian men were killed, all the women and children were sold into slavery, and the city itself was razed to the ground. Countless treasures and artwork looted from Corinth were shipped to Rome, and alongside loot from other parts of the Greek-speaking world such as Syracuse, contributed to the Romans adopting many aspects of Greek culture as their own, to the point that about 100 years after the sack of Corinth, the Roman poet Horace famously wrote, "Conquered Greece took captive her savage conqueror." But at the time of the destruction of Corinth, the uncouth Romans were still quite oblivious to the significance of what they had just destroyed. And perhaps no Roman exemplified this attitude more so than Mummius, who, as he watched workers load the looted Corinthian artworks onto ships destined for Rome, said, "If you damage or lose anything, you will have to replace it." Corinth ceased to exist for another century until it was reestablished by Julius Caesar in 44 BC, shortly before his assassination. The new Corinth again grew into a major city and was an early center of Christianity, with members of the church in Corinth the audience of 2 of Paul the Apostle's letters. Ancient Corinth remains a significant archaeological site to this day, although the ruins we now see are not Greek, but Roman. The Olympic Games continued during the Roman Republic and Empire, and as Greek culture became more and more popular in the Roman world, these games also became important events for people throughout the empire. They lasted well into the 300s AD, until the games and the site were gradually abandoned due to earthquakes, barbarian invasions, and the rise of Christianity. Olympia is now an important archaeological site, although the fate of the statue of Zeus at Olympia remains unknown. After the Achaean War, Sparta joined the Roman Republic as a free city. Under Roman rule, the Spartans held on to what was left of their ancient customs as best as they could, and Sparta itself became a tourist attraction for educated Romans. But as time went on, the settlement declined more and more, until it simply disappeared into history. Perhaps for a people that glorify war as much as the ancient Spartans did, the worst fate that could have befallen their city was not to be destroyed in battle like Corinth, but to simply sink into irrelevance. But even if the final fate of Sparta was rather ignominious, its achievements during its heyday have still lived on throughout the centuries to the present day.